Welcome back, focused learners. Okay, so today we are looking at what is essentially a master architectural plan. We're breaking down the 2020 non-deposit taking SACO regulations, specifically zooming in on parts 3 and 4. And honestly, don't just think of these regulations as some dry, boring legal document. It's actually a structural blueprint for financial stability. We're going to build up your understanding piece by piece using our sketchnote framework so you can see exactly how a modern SACO is designed to weather literally any storm. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our agenda for today's explainer. 1. Core capital rules. 2. The liquidity framework. 3. Penalties for falling short. And finally, 4. Strictly prohibited activities.
Section 1. Core capital rules. The structural foundation.
So, Part 3 of the 2020 regulations is really all about building this long-term shield to protect the SACO from risk. Think about it like this. If your SACO is a fortress, core capital is the thickness of your stone walls. Right off the bat, Regulation 11 lays down the absolute bedrock, 5 million shillings. This is the non-negotiable, absolute minimum core capital required to even play the game. If your core capital drops below this line, well, your foundational integrity is immediately compromised. But, a flat number like that isn't really enough to secure a growing organization all on its own.
Because as your SACO grows, those walls need to get thicker, right? That's exactly why the regulations also require core capital to be at least 8% of your total assets. And here is the absolutely crucial caveat to that. At least 50% of this core capital must be composed of retained earnings and disclosed reserves. The regulators don't just want to see cash being injected from the outside. They want to see organically generated sustainable wealth. They want proof that the SACO is structurally sound on its own merits.
Moving on, your core capital also has to hit at least 5% of your total non-withdrawable deposits. And remember, these are the deposits held directly on behalf of the members. This rule is super important because it ensures there's always a dedicated capital cushion directly scaled to the size of the members' committed savings. It's literally keeping their hard-earned money shielded from any sudden internal shocks.
But what happens if the environment gets a little hostile? Well, the authority basically acts like a really strict building inspector. There are specific triggers that allow them to step right in and demand even higher capital ratios. If they look closely and see dangerous structural cracks, things like taking on high-risk exposure, suffering losses that cause a deficiency, hoarding a severe volume of poor-quality assets, or even just rapid growth without adequate capitalization, they will act. Throw in adverse activities from subsidiaries or contravening their directives, and boom, they will force you to reinforce those walls immediately.
All right, let's pivot slightly here and compare core capital with liquidity. If core capital is your long-term structural health, those thick stone walls of your fortress we just talked about, then liquidity is your short-term operational cash. It's the electricity, it's the running water, keeping the lights on day to day. You absolutely need both to survive, but they function in very different ways.
Section 2. The liquidity framework. The operational fuel.
Part 4 of the regulations makes it crystal clear. Managing your day-to-day cash flow cannot just be left to chance. Let's walk through Regulation 14. First up, the board of directors actually has to approve a formal liquidity policy. They architect this strategy by appointing a technical management team to handle the daily operations. Then, they set strict maximum and minimum cash thresholds. And, maybe most importantly, they have to establish crisis contingency plans. So if normal funding gets disrupted, the board already needs a pre-approved blueprint for exactly how the SACO is going to survive the emergency.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the strict requirement it reveals. By law, a non-deposit taking SACO must maintain a liquidity ratio of not less than 10% of its non-withdrawable deposits and short-term liabilities. You absolutely must have this 10% readily available in liquid assets at all times. It's the only way to keep the operational engine running smoothly without seizing up.
But here's the catch. You can't just count anything as a liquid asset. The regulations strictly define what actually permits toward that 10% ratio. We are talking highly accessible funds here. Think actual physical notes and coins, government securities, net balances held at licensed banking institutions, deposits at other SACOs that mature in under 91 days, and electronic transfer balances. Basically, if you can't convert it to cash almost instantly, it does not count as operational fuel, period.
Moving into Section 3, penalties for falling short, the danger zone. So, what actually happens when this blueprint is ignored? Well, the authority has a very specific toolkit of sanctions they can deploy. Let's look at this table. If you suffer a capital deficiency, they can just freeze your core business. We're talking suspending you from lending, prohibiting land buys, and completely blocking any new deposits. On the flip side, if you suffer a liquidity strain, meaning you fail that 10% rule, they target your cash outflow. They'll block dividends, prohibit staff bonuses, and halt non-core asset buys. Essentially, they put the entire business in a straitjacket until it's compliant again.
And remember, merely being compliant in the background isn't enough to save you. You have to prove it regularly. Both capital adequacy and liquidity statements must be submitted to the authority every single quarter. If the SACO, or even the specific relevant officer responsible, fails to submit these returns, you're hit with an immediate financial penalty of 50,000 shillings. So yeah, paperwork really matters in this blueprint.
Finally, Section 4, Strictly Prohibited Activities, the absolute no-go zone.
Regulation 16 outlines all the activities that are strictly off-limits. Engaging in any of these is essentially like building an illegal, highly volatile extension onto your perfectly compliant fortress. Let's run through these quickly because it's a hard no for all of them. A non-deposit-taking SACO absolutely cannot run a deposit-taking business. You are fully barred from foreign trade operations and dealing in cryptocurrencies. No way. You cannot offer trust or custodial services, you can't act as a venture capital investor, and you definitely cannot underwrite securities. On top of that, you're prohibited from buying land unnecessarily unless it's strictly for expanding your specific SACO business space, and you cannot transact business with non-members. The message is clear: stay in your lane or face some very severe regulatory consequences.
Well, we have covered a whole lot of ground today. We've looked closely at capital foundations, liquidity flow, penalty straitjackets, and those prohibited danger zones. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative question to ask yourself and your own team. Is your SACO's blueprint structurally sound and fully compliant with the 2020 regulations? Take a hard look, because in the eyes of the authority, there is absolutely zero room for guesswork.
Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And remember, for specialized consulting on these matters and to see how this roadmap fits your organization, please reach out directly at 010-719-089.